Hello listeners everywhere. Welcome to the Archive of Audio Antiquities, a voyage into the vault of wonders on the wireless. In a moment, Simon Exton and Ken Moss will be here to speak to you.
Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to the Archive of Audio Antiquities. I'm Ken Moss.
I'm Simon Exton.
And this month we're listening to Toby Hadoke's 2018 radio adaptation of Nigel Neal's The Road. This was broadcast on BBC Radio 4 and is an adaptation of a 1963 television play on BBC TV, which was originally part of the anthology drama series First Night. There was an Australian remake later the following year, but no recordings of the production on either video or audio are known to exist. Well, we're looking at the BBC adaptation, the radio adaptation, starring Mark Gatiss and Adrian Scarborough. And the premise of this is that it's the late 18th century. A small English village is haunted by ghostly apparitions. Sir Timothy Hassel, accompanied by his friend Gideon Cole, investigate.
An eccentric name for a hostelry. The Three Companions. A donkey, a dragoon, and death, no less.
Presumably death is there to encourage more drinking.
I need no dire signage for that. Jethro.
Yes, master.
That landlord is taking an age with my brandy and the logs. Expedite one or other for me, will you?
Master.
Here you. Oh, well, if not my brandy, then at least my quarry. You must be the squire.
Yes. Sir Timothy Hassel, at your service, sir.
Gideon Cobb, and likewise. And that makes 3 companions of us. Carry on, Jethro.
Your brandy, master.
Well, I prefer brandy to logs anyway. At least it washes away the coffee. That really was the work of the devil. Perhaps he's too busy spoiling your coffee to walk abroad tonight, eh, Squire?
Dr. Exton, do you want to give us a little bit more colour on this?
Yes. In a wood somewhere in the 18th century, a local girl has come across a whole load of sort of haunted voices and has been a bit freaked out by this. And the wood is supposed to have a history of having been haunted by warriors of Boudica who were fleeing north and were ambushed by the Romans, and there was a big battle there. And she's insistent that that's not it, that there was the sound of feet on cobbles and clearly the sound of a child and nothing to do with Boudica. So there's planned to be an investigation. It's headed up by the local squire, who is a wannabe scientist, and he's taking along a whole load of measuring equipment, so barometers and thermometers and that kind of thing. And he goes and fixes up tuning forks to the woodland and warning bells and things like that. And he's accompanied by a couple of his servants and a philosopher up from London, who is arguing that all this science is unnecessary and everything can be worked out by the application of the little grey cells. There's the squire's wife, and there's also the sort of servant companion of the philosopher, who is a black man that he is very proud to have educated. They go and look to the investigation. Both of the characters are shown to be incredibly idealistic, diametrically opposed, and also very flawed. And we'll come on to this in the analysis. And not all of the squire's servants are there happily, and one of them's got a bit drunk beforehand and deliberately sets off all the alarms to have a joke with them. And then the voices start, and when you hear the voices, they're clearly coming from the future, because there's a radio announcement that's talking about nuclear strikes and missiles flying. And there's a family they can hear saying, "Oh, get out of the car," and trying to calm down the little girl who's there, who's terrified. And then just as they're talking about missile strikes, the noise off the road disappears. And they all realise that rather than hearing and seeing visions of the past, what they're seeing is what's going to happen. And that at some point there will be a road built through that village, and the people on that road a ways in the future are going to end up dying as a result of this nuclear explosion. And they're all a little upset by this. And the girl that they insisted on bringing along, who was the one that originally heard the voices and is very sensitive to this, is found dead and presumably having died of fright.
Now, I hadn't heard of this, and we heard it at the time, and we've obviously heard it quite recently in preparation for this. I came into it with a bit of an open mind because I'd forgotten quite a lot of it, to be honest. The sound design, I'll talk about that first. It's BBC Radio. You know that it's going to be good. But there's an interview with Toby Haydock on We Are Cult from 2018, and he says that Mark Ayres, who is he's an audio genius, really. He knows things that he brings old recordings back to life in a way that I've never heard anyone else do ever. But he unearthed the original sound effects reel from 1963. So a lot of the sound effects that we used in this radio version are from the original TV play, which I think is a nice touch. It does conjure up the imagery, particularly when they're in the hostel, the three companions. And right from the opening, you're drawn into this 18th century world. It paints the picture very vividly before you really get anywhere near the story. I know I'm a little bit more technically anal about this than you are, but what did you think of all the actual design of the thing?
I thought it sounded fantastic. I thought the sound design, you could really tell when they left the pub and went off into the forest. It was really nicely done when the alarms were triggered, and it could have overwhelmed and it didn't.
Even down to little things like moving jars and bits of equipment on the bar, I thought was lovely. When it comes to casting, Mark Gatiss really, this is very much his period. He's very much an 18th century buff. He loves all this sort of stuff. So he was a logical choice, and sparring opposite him is Adrian Scarborough as the Squire. And he's another one. He's got a lovely radio voice that I think suits this part brilliantly. Again, in the cast, you got Hattie Morahan, whose father worked on the original TV play. Again, another nice touch.
He was the director, wasn't he?
I think so, yes.
Christopher Morahan.
That's the one. I think the only bit of casting I thought was a little bit of a misstep was Jethro. Now, in the original, he was the black landlord of the pub, and this is all dealt with within the context of the story. And looking back at the original Radio Times photograph, he was a black landlord in the originals. It looks like that's a fairly faithful move forward. But he was
played by Clifton Jones, who went on to appear in, among other things, UFO.
Ah, right. I must have been looking at a different cast list. It's Reg somebody or other in the original listings.
Reg Lever is the landlord. Clifton Jones played Jethro, who wasn't the landlord. He was Gideon Cobb's servant.
Yeah, because in this radio version, some of the characters have been conflated, just purely for reasons of scale, and that's just how things work on radio.
I think there's only one that's been cut out, isn't there? There were three sort of assistant yokels, Big Jeff, Lukey Chase and Sam Towler, and the character of Sam Towler was cut out, who was originally played by Rodney Buse. Then you had the landlord and his daughter, who's the one who originally saw the apparitions, and then Jethro.
Oh, that's my mistake then. I thought Jethro was supposed to be the landlord.
No, the landlord is billed as landlord.
Right, but he doesn't appear in this, does he? Unless I've missed a line. Does he?
Yes.
Oh, I must have missed it. It must have been a tiny part.
Do you not remember when Tetsi isn't wanting to say what she saw and all of that, then her father is there saying, oh, this is the Squire, you have to tell him what you know, basically do your duty, wench. But yeah, he's definitely in there.
Oh, right, I've missed it. It wasn't a very big part either way. But the only thing about Jethro I thought was a bit of a misstep. He had quite a well-turned English accent, and it's stated quite clearly within the script that he grew up as a boy in Jamaica.
But he's been educated / civilized by Gideon, who, in amongst all the other education he would have done, would probably have taught him how to speak properly. That didn't ping on me at all.
Oh, I thought it would have been better to give him a little bit of a Jamaican lilt, even if it was only a gentle... I agree that elocution would have been part of the training, but that was very good.
Yeah, in terms of casting, I do think that there's one person who's miscast, and I think that person is Mark Gatiss.
Yeah, you've got a downer on Mark Gatiss, whereas I think that he's perfect for this sort of thing.
I don't have a downer on Mark Gatiss. I think, like Catherine Tate, he is a very good comic actor who doesn't do drama terribly well. So with this, everybody else is playing it as a drama and he's playing it as a caricature, and it really jars.
Now, you see, I don't hear that at all. And I think that he does this 17th, 18th century character.
He's playing the 18th century League of Gentlemen. Everybody else is playing it straight.
No, I'm not sure I agree. I don't know. But
It came across as a real disjoint. There was that whole little Dr. Chinnery lilty giggle throughout his performance. I don't have a downer on him. I think he is very good and very talented at what he does, but what he does is comedy, not drama. And I think the same about Catherine Tate.
Oh dear, oh dear.
The rest of the cast were brilliant. And again, it's the Nick Briggs thing. You put them up against somebody who is the class of Adrian Scarborough, and they are going to be outclassed.
No, you see, I really disagree on this with Mark Gatiss.
To be fair, less so Mark Gatiss than Nick Briggs, who I don't think is terribly good. Mark Gatiss, I think, is good as a comic actor. I think it spills over into this. And to be fair, the biggest chunk of that is direction rather than the way he's playing it, because that's the sort of thing you would expect the director to say, come on, listen to the way everybody else is doing this, listen to the way that you're doing it, and rein it in.
You're a harsh man. I've said this before. I had no problems with that at all.
And I've said before, I'm a consumer. I don't automatically think somebody gets an easy ride because they've been in Doctor Who.
Nothing to do with Doctor Who.
Of course it has.
It doesn't. I knew him as League of Gentlemen long before his association with Doctor Who, even going back to Phantasmagoria.
But with this, where you've got a Doctor Who fan driving it, I mean, either you've got a very weak director, or you've got a director who has not been prepared to rein in his actor sufficiently, or you've got an actor who just doesn't have the chops to do the way it needed to be done. Whatever happened, his performance jarred.
Well, I didn't think so, but we have different views, as is frequently the case. Moving on to the story itself.
It was a dry run for the Stone Tape.
It was. And I can't say the story itself blew me away. The bare bones of it were pretty good, actually. I love the setting and I love the premise of it. I think there was an awful lot of talky to pad out the running time, and there were discussions in there. The majority of the play was discussions about morality and scientific approach versus philosophical approach, and the premise of the thing, this haunted wood, was actually a bit of a background plot for the vast majority of the play, even when they were walking around it. So it's not the strongest of plots. It's one of those things where you listen to it for the performances and the set pieces and the dialogue, rather than the meat and potatoes of the story, which only really truly kicks in the final 5 minutes.
I think the plot is good. I think the nature of it works well as an audio adaptation in the way that some of the other missing Nigel Neal wouldn't. So, I mean, you cannot possibly imagine The Wine of India as an audio adaptation. The shock on that in that is so visual that it really needs to be seen. And, you know, when I was a Baby Telly Fantasy fan, they were really regarded as being 4 standalone Nigel Neal plays: The Road, The Year of the Sex Olympics, The Stone Tape, and The Wine of India. And of those, the first and the last, so The Road and The Wine of India, don't exist. The nature of this plot, I think, transfers well to an audio medium. The Wine of India wouldn't. I think it was interesting how the 2 lead characters were written as both considering themselves modern intellectual, the vanguard of the future, really, but also incredibly flawed, partly by the egotism that they cannot possibly surrender any of their viewpoint to the other person's, but also the way they treat the people around them. Now, you've got Sir Timothy, who is all scientific method and trying to be supportive of Jethro, and do you think he treats you just like another experiment? But he's completely dismissive of his wife. And there's do you not know how to use this equipment? No, I've never been shown. Every interaction he has with her is dismissive. You've got Gideon, who is talking about intellectual philosophy as the thing that will move society forward. But he treats Jethro as a possession, or as an experiment. Look what I have done to this otherwise formless piece of clay. They both come across as idealistic, flawed, and really very inflexible. They're kind of like mirror images of each other.
Yes, I'll give you that.
That's where a lot of the dialogue comes, where they're talking backwards and forwards. Now, I do think that there was a bit of attempted comic relief in the middle that misstepped and just took you away from the theme of the piece. And that's where Sir Timothy walks into his own trap, and it's a bit of sort of audio slapstick. I don't think that worked.
Got to agree with that. It didn't do anything at all for the plot. It was a stumble, really.
And okay, it preludes the bit where Big Jeff goes and deliberately sets them off as a joke before the noises are heard. And actually, that's quite a nice character piece because he starts off not wanting to be involved with this at all. He's obviously scared. He gets some Dutch courage inside him in the pub, but still isn't wanting to go and has to be told to go back to his place. And
yeah, that was one of the few bits in the piece that I didn't particularly care for, was when they're getting right to the end, everything's ramping up, and then Big Jeff sets off a trap as a joke. I mean, I'm sure that was in the original script, but they've been terrified yokels all the way through this piece. It just didn't really sit well that one of them would set it off as a joke to his employers. So that didn't really sit well with me. That I just sort of leapt over as a bit of fluff, but I thought, that didn't really need to be in there. But then we actually do get to the denouement where, I mean, it's very well described as seeing this road as sort of lightning flashes, and the sound design and the audio realises that very well. And those lightning flashes get more and more frequent until Gideon can actually see and hear what's going on this road. And he believes it, and it breaks him. The road that will be built in the future where they're standing in the wood.
yeah, you see, and that didn't work for me. It was somebody whose whole philosophical view was being ripped apart, and it was still being played as a joke.
What do you think?
Yeah.
I'm not entirely convinced, because the last scene of the play, spoiler alert coming up, kids, the preceding programme does contain spoilers, but the very last bit of the play is Gideon's character, this philosopher from London who believes in reason and a better world coming in the future when we've invested in machines and technology and a better way of thinking and abandoned God, breaks down into uncontrollable sobbing when he sees this road and how the future is going to be. I think the sobbing might have been a little bit overdone. Outright shock and a sort of, rather than a complete emotional breakdown would have been more powerful. That's my only touch on it.
I think the whole performance was a caricature and didn't work against the seriousness of all of the other performances.
Oh, but again, I'm putting that last scene down to the direction and how it's been adapted for it may well have been how it was in the original version. I just think the sobbing from a man in that period, and particularly with the strength of his convictions, I don't know. I just think that stiff upper lip would not have been so easily crumbled. Maybe, I don't know. I just didn't particularly care for the melodrama of that very last scene. But on the whole, the adaptation and the way it's done for radio, I think it works very well. And I think it's been translated very well from screen to radio, as is often the way with these scripts.
Yes, because, I mean, this was 1963. It was about 6 weeks before Doctor Who started, so special effects would have been at that level. There probably wasn't an awful lot that they could do. I mean, I could be wrong, but I think in the original, there wasn't any visualization of the road. It was all done with audio and the characters' reactions to the audio as it appears. And that translates very nicely to an audio play.
Beyond vision mixing to a VT feed, I can't see how else they would have done it apart from characters staring to camera wild-eyed and describing what they were seeing in front of them with an audio effect in 1963. I just can't see it. With a lot of these things, I just think a radio adaptation, it just brings the whole thing to life in a way that TV of the time couldn't. As we've seen with the Big Finish Avengers, some of those radio plays or the audio adaptations they must be more vivid visually than the TV versions at the time. So my love of radio it's never ending. I think that a really good audio adaptation of something can be equally, if not better, than the visuals that it's either emulating or has replaced.
To be fair, that goes in completely the opposite way to your comments about an audio adaptation is never going to be as good as the visual when we were talking about the Avengers. But, you're allowed to be inconsistent.
No, what I said was that I don't think there's anybody, even the production team, would prefer to have an audio adaptation than a copy of a missing TV episode. I think that's a different thing. Where the Avengers are concerned, I've loved the audio adaptations of at least one of the TV versions better than the TV version. But I don't think there's anybody out there that would say, would you prefer to have a good radio copy or the original TV master? I think the vast majority of people would want to see the original lost episode. That was my view on audio adaptations. But I think that there's a lot can be done with an audio adaptation that, to be honest, even now you couldn't get away with on television.
I think you can. I don't think it happens very often. I think if this were readapted for television, it could be really interesting. I don't think it ever would be, because the whole crux of the antagonism between the two main characters is philosophical and intellectual, and you don't really get that in drama these days. There has to be shock and spectacle, and I think if this were put out on telly now in a shiny new HD, wonderful sound, brilliant special effects, when you actually get to them, I think it would have lost almost all of its audience by being so talky beforehand. I think as a drama, it's of its time and it wouldn't work on television now. I think it works on radio because the people who listen to radio have a bit of an attention span and can put two and two together without being spoon-fed. And it doesn't have to be drama on drama on drama on drama to maintain the attention. You can have these sort of slower burn intellectual plots.
I'd have to agree totally with that, yeah. And this sort of play for today 1 hour thing that you used to get in the 60s, 70s, 80s, I think the time for those, unfortunately, has passed, or certainly adaptations of things like this. They would have to be more slick affairs now, and as you say, more drama. So yeah, it would unfortunately be lost on a modern audience as a modern retelling. Shame. But at least we get radio adaptations, and I'm happy to continue with my snobbery that I fall into that radio category.
I don't think it's snobbery. I think it's a different kind of enjoyment.
It is, but me and you know damn well that the vast majority of people will have no interest and look down on talky radio when they can watch it on the big screen.
So if there's any snobbery involved, it's from that direction.
A good point, well
rather
made.
Than from aficionados of the radio. We have, in the original version on telly, a few Who alumni.
Do we? Fire away. We've got Rodney Bewes.
We have James Maxwell, who played Sir Timothy, who was The Quest is the Quest in Underworld.
Okay.
Can't remember the name of the character. And as well as his appearance on Doctor Who, James Maxwell also appeared in possibly one of the weirdest things that the BBC put out in terms of science fiction, which was a thing called Hands Across the Sky from 1960, which was a science fiction opera.
There's some stuff put out on television in the 60s and 70s. I think it was the product of shell shock.
I have a little quote from Hands Across the Sky where somebody sings, "I chased him through the uranium deposit. Now he's locked himself in the heavy water closet."
We'll park that there.
So you were saying something about shell shock. And Reg Lever, who played the landlord, was the Joker in the Celestial Toymaker.
Got to some real classic stories.
Jackson.
Oh, in
character in
Underworld. Yeah. A classic. Disclaimer, it isn't. Shall we rate this in earworms?
This is the song that never ends. Yes, it goes on and on, my friends.
How many are you giving this out of 10?
8. It's a great story, although a little wordy. It's very well acted for the most part, but I've said before there is one performance that jars and stands out. It is a bit slow. The intellectual argument between the two main characters isn't actually that interesting, to be perfectly honest. And the whole concept of the place absorbing a tragedy is better done in the stone tape.
Yeah, I'd have to concur with that. It's 8 out of 10 for me. I did enjoy it. I don't think that the story holds up terribly well. Or it's not. It is more the dramatic interactions between the characters than the actual premise of the story. but it exists as a radio adaptation. It's as polished as I think we could wish for. I do think it was well acted. I enjoyed it. Would I rush back to it? Probably not, but I love stuff like this. Certainly the setting conjured up a period of history that I'm very fond of. For that reason alone, it's one to listen to on a dark night, preferably with crappy weather outside and the candles and nothing else, and just let yourself be seeped into a spooky ghost story at night.
Yeah, so it's a proper Halloween listen. So, is this going to find its way into your regular listening?
I think this is one that I will come back to at Halloween. It does have that sort of vibe about it. It's not
We'll just have to hope it gets a commercial release then.
We can hope. But like we say, hunt it down, but listen to it late at night. It's not one for listening to on your drive to work or in a sunny afternoon beer garden.
And following on from that, if you're listening to audio drama in a beer garden, you're in the wrong beer garden. And just before we leave, one other interesting thing that's happened recently is that the BFI have done a live adaptation of another missing Nigel Neal play. This time his missing episode of Out of the Unknown from the 4th season, The Chopper. And in the cast, Matthew Waterhouse played the part that was originally played by Patrick Troughton.
I do remember reading that somewhere. I can't remember where it was now. It's fairly recently though, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. But hopefully somebody enterprising, perhaps Tony Haydock, could get that done as a BBC adaptation, this time with people who can act.
Burn. Is that out of your system now?
Oh, you wait till we come to do First Men in the Moon.
And they'll continue singing it forever just because.
What have you got to recommend for us this week, podcast-wise?
Right, well, I'm going to recommend a Blake 7 podcast.
Ooh, tell me more.
Maximum Power.
It's called Maximum Power. They are doing an episode-by-episode description and analysis of the episodes. It's not a live watch, and it is presented by a fantastically entertaining group of geeks who utterly love Blake 7.
I'm not a massive fan. I don't know it encyclopedically, but I rediscovered it on UK Gold when it was broadcast in the early 90s, and I fell in love with it, and it was great. So an episodic rewatch, now that's very much my sort of thing, funnily enough. I will give that a go.
The only thing that I would say is that they kind of assume that you know the nuts and bolts of the episodes. They won't give you the plot. They launch straight into the critique. You're going to listen to it, and it's well worth listening to. Watch the episode they're going to talk about beforehand if you don't know it reasonably well.
And with that, boys and girls, I'll sign us off. Next month, we'll be listening to the BBC Victor Pemberton serial from the 1960s, The Slide. Now, I've loved this. I think it was you that introduced me to this a long time ago. And this is a good one. This is a great piece of radio. I think, if I'm not wrong, it's on the Blu-ray and DVD of Doctor Who Fury from the Deep. I think.
Oh, is it?
I'm fairly sure. As an extra.
I mean, I've got the original BBC CDs when they came out.
But either way, if you want to listen along with us, boys and girls, that is what we'll be doing. Until then, thank you for listening. We hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll be back next time.
Goodbye now.
The Archive of Audio Antiquities featured Simon Exton and Ken Moss, and the announcer was Jenny at Blue Box 99. All featured soundtracks are the property of their respective producers, and no infringement of copyright is intended. Title music was by Edward White, and the programme was produced by Maverick Productions. For more information, please visit maverickproductionsuk.blogspot.com or find us on social media.